Hi guys, welcome to LaForte Daily Demos, where I share my classroom design drawing and sketching demos for my students and anyone else who wants to improve their design drawing and rendering fundamentals. In today's videos, I'm going to cover some basic cube construction, shadow casting, and light logic, as well as plane contrast and developing your contrast in your sketch. Right now I'm sketching out or blocking out the basic cube construction. Again, sketch lightly your pen. This initial cube is actually given a little 3-point perspective. In other words, the vertical edges of the object converge to a third vanishing point down below. I recommend sketching through your form, again, very lightly with your pen. In this case, I'm using a fine tip Sharpie pen to just lay down the initial base work. Next to it, I'm going to start to sketch here a second cube, and this one is just a traditional 2-point perspective. I'm shifting a little bit its position in the space, but otherwise its vertical edges need to be parallel and vertical. And again, sketch lightly until you start to get a feel for where your cube is in perspective and whether you have your proportions and your convergence under control. As you develop more experience and you get better at it, you can take some more shortcuts and you don't have to do quite so much sketching to get to your results. But I highly recommend that you begin with really base light sketching through and really understand your geometry and your forms before you start taking any shortcuts. If you sketch through, your geometry should come together and in the back of the object. Imagine it being like a glass cube or like a fish tank, and your corners and intersections should all come together. If they don't come together, then it's a good indication that maybe some of your lines aren't converging or your verticals aren't really parallel, or something's drifting on you. And it's important to double check your work, double check your eye. Today we're going to talk about color and color value. And very often when students are rendering, they will sort of flatten out the object and render an object with only one value. In other words, coloring each of the planes the same value of yellow or red or blue or whatever that plastic object or painted surface might tend to be. If we do that, and here I'm laying down my left plane and I'm reinforcing the line to the vanishing point. So those marker strokes are actually kind of fanning towards and converging towards the left vanishing point. If I were to leave that plane alone, I might start to lay down the foundation for maybe wood grain or some other type of texture. I'm going to do the same thing here on the right side and give myself a little bit of a frame on that plane. It's very important to isolate your planes and work on only one plane at a time and allow those planes to have their space and their own kind of identity. And then you start to get your edges to emerge. But right now, if we squinted our eyes, we would see that each of the 3 planes that identify this cube, the top plane, the left, the right, are all appearing flat to our eye because there's no real definition or contrast between the 3 values of yellow that's been laid down. It's been a single pass of the yellow marker. Today I'm working on pretty standard bond paper, so it's not going to move and you're not going to get the blending that you might get out of, or that you will get out of marker paper. So it's going to be a little stickier. The marker strokes are going to kind of hold up a bit more and you're going to get a little bit more of that density. So here I'm going back over the top plane with a second pass. I didn't have to necessarily. I could have left that first pass with just a single pass and a lot lighter, but now you can see the top plane has gotten very dark relative to the 2 vertical faces. And if our light source was very low, maybe getting late in the day, early in the morning, we might have a very low light source, or maybe dramatic light in a space or something like that. And in that case, our right side plane, I'm choosing to make the right side plane the lighter of the 2 of the vertical faces. But in this case, one of our vertical faces would be lighter than the top plane if the light source is low. In this case, I'm going to choose to cast a shadow off to the left side. And that means now I have a problem, which is my top plane and my left plane are reading to the eye to equal. Happens that I have my coffee mug here and I picked a yellow that kind of matched it. I didn't really intend to do that, but it just sort of happened. Coming back over the right plane and giving it a little bit, closing up some of the white values through the paper, and just kind of really flushing it out and filling it up. And now you're starting to see that the three planes are really kind of looking too flat. Getting these little white edges between the three planes, which is nice. But at some point I need to start to push three plane logic on the cube, or else it's going to continue to read flat. In this case, I'm using a warm gray to complement the warm value of the yellow. Yellow is a warm value, so I'm going to use a warm gray. Could have been a neutral gray. I would avoid using a cool gray in this case. It might kind of clash with the warm value of the yellow base value. And starting to dull down the shade side of the object where the shadow is going to cast off of. So now I've got 1, 2, 3 plane values. My sensibility was that the top plane in this case was reading a little too saturated, a little too much chroma, and I wanted to dirty it up a little bit so that it would feel a little bit better matched to that left plane. So I came across it with a number 2 warm gray, and that just dirtied up the coloration of this kind of mustard yellow, allowing that right side plane to really read like its truest natural value or color. Here I'm doing a little shadow cast, and in this case I'm doing what's called a negative light, which means that the light source is behind us and off to our right shoulder, or behind us and off to the right. And that means that the shadow is casting away from the cube and sort of stretching out and somewhat dramatic, and also converging towards the horizon line, which becomes really very, very critical in larger objects, or where you can actually see the horizon line. In projects like buildings or any kind of tall form where you might start to approach your horizon line if you cast a shadow, you really need that shadow to converge. So you have to start to develop a wider arsenal of shadow casting than just simple parallel shadow casting, which works great in a lot of industrial design projects and a lot of small scenarios, but it can really betray your scene logic at times. So give it a little bit more natural feel and a little bit more dynamics maybe. Sometimes it's nice to develop a convergence type of shadow. So here I'm laying down a simple base value, maybe a sort of a warm beige. I've already done that, sorry, I laid down that warm beige. Talking about the color of the shadow, or the value of the shadow. The shadow will take on the character and the identity in terms of its coloration and value of whatever surface it's sitting on, minus the absence of light, which is the absence of the light that the block or the box or the object that you've designed is blocking. So in this case I laid down a base value of the surface. Maybe it's sand, maybe it's a tabletop of soft birch kind of wood or something like that. And now I'm applying my my gray value. In this case I'm using a neutral, I think a number 4 marker. That just gives me room to set up my eye, start to see the scene, look for where I'm missing contrast. I can always push that shadow deeper and darker. I can also push the object deeper and stronger as well. I'm going to move on now to the right cube, and very often we have a difficult time with very dark objects, and yet we have plenty of objects in our real world that may in fact be very very dark forms. So here I'm just blocking out my cube in a very deep rich sort of like a cobalt blue. I don't recall exactly which blue this is. Double checking my work, seeing if I've made any mistakes in my convergence, my perspective. Looks like that very top back edge might be converging a little bit quickly, but it's a quick demo. So this video is sped up about 200%, or 200 twice as fast as the actual demo. So I don't really sketch as fast as it appears in this video, but I don't want to take up all your time either. So again, I'm isolating each plane, laying down a single pass of the base blue value, and just getting the ball rolling with that. Very often students will leave their objects sort of like this. One pass or two passes are oversaturated, but oversaturated throughout all the planes, and the object doesn't read. I encourage my students to render without the edges, without the ink line edges first, and determine from that whether they've got the plane contrast that they need, and whether it's reinforcing the light logic where their shadow casting is going to be, where their light source is, and determine that stuff without heavy and strong line work first. Here I'm casting a shadow, and this time I'm using a simple parallel system, so it's not really matching the shadow casting. I just wanted to talk about two different types of shadow castings on these objects. So this shadow casting doesn't really work with the shadow casting of the gold block, but because it's a parallel shadow cast and not a convergence type of shadow casting. So here I'm just mapping out where the back edges are. I'm using a very dramatic low light again, and really looking at where the light angle is. So I'm sketching here with my Sharpie, very thin, very light. If you have a very heavy hand, that's an area that you really need to practice. In other words, if you make your line work too strong, too fast, too heavy, I really encourage you to back off and develop the lightness in your pen stroke. Just let the pen just barely graze across the surface. Here I am relating the two cubes in space and recognizing that because they are rotated relative to each other, the shadow cast on the yellow block will not just be a straight line or horizontal line across that face. It's probably going to angle up at some amount. So I'm doing a little backtracking here, plotting the vertical edge down to the ground, back over to the blue cube to the left, to the right, back over to the blue cube to the right, to the left plane, and then back up that surface, straight up, vertically up that surface, to the top edge, and then casting the light off of that imaginary point on that edge. And I get my how much that is angling up that surface. Again, these demos are primarily provided to complement my classroom. So I go through this in the class. This is a video or demo that's been done in the class, and this is really meant to be a supplement and not or a reminder to students of what was presented or shown, and so they can replay it, pause it, and recall what was discussed. In other videos, I'll tackle maybe with more detail shadow cast construction and light logic and things like that, but that'll take a lot more patient and long videos probably to really block out the geometry of that. This is not from a beginning perspective class, so at this point it's expected that the students have at least some fundamental knowledge of shadow construction and light logic and things. Here I'm talking about, I'm just laying down my base value. Again, it's a number 4 marker. Identifying that although I have a number 4 value up the side of on the vertical plane of the gold box, that's not going to be able to stay that way. I'm going to need to buy some contrast again between the ground plane and that vertical plane. And I have to make a choice about which of those two planes do I think might be the lighter of the two planes, which one might be the darker. And again, on my blue box, how low is my light angle? And here I'm isolating and showing you that if you squint your eyes, you can't see any contrast between the vertical plane and the horizontal plane. And again, beginning design students often make the mistake of flattening that out and not allowing there to be enough contrast. So one of these has to develop, essentially. I'm going to make a choice that I think the vertical plane might be the lighter of the two planes, especially with a low light source, a low light angle. And I'm coming back across that shadow on the ground with, I believe, either number 5 or number 6 marker. Again, a neutral gray, and developing a little bit more weight or base to the ground plane to build up the contrast here. If I do this on the blue cube, I'm also going to work off to the right and redevelop the shadow on the right, the gold cube. So those start to balance out. You might see a little bit of a white of the paper coming through at the base of the gold cube over there where it meets the shadow. I'm a big fan of letting little opportunities like that come through in your work. It makes the work look more natural, more believable, more organic in a way. Not necessarily that it's an organic form, but allows there to be little glow effect and little light effects that are making your drawing, your rendering a lot more rich and a lot more natural. You can see there I just added a little bit more depth to that left plane of the blue cube. And just because after letting the markers sit, they sometimes dry a little bit lighter. And also working in a little bit more contrast on that gold cube as well, on that left plane. Here I'm talking about transitioning that value a little bit, adding a little bit more depth to the value up in the top right corner, the leading corner of the cube, and then letting that value fade off as it drops down off to meet the ground. Here I'm just taking those little white edges and using a white pencil, sharp white Prismacolor pencil, just kind of burning out those edges. A different technique might be to just use a black ink pen and fill in those edges with your technical pen or your Sharpie, and identify those as sharp, crisp corners. In this case, I felt like making these edges burn out a little bit, give them a little bit of a corner rounding. And now I'm using a really simple, just an ordinary Papermate flare. There's nothing special about this pen, real cheap from Staples or Office Max. And I'm using that as my profile line value. My sensibility on these cubes, what I was comparing is the different tips that I have on the Sharpie, which is the ultra fine tip, and then a really heavy kind of fat tip on the other end of that Sharpie. And the Papermate is a nice in-between. So if you've got like a 1, 2, 3 value on those tips, the Papermate would be the 2. And now I'm just coming through on the cube, on the gold cube, and fleshing out its profile line as well. And you notice I like to work on the verticals at the same time, and then I'll also work on the two edges that are converging at the same time. And I'm just making an indication, a note for my students to identify that this is in fact a 3-point cube and not just simply a tapered block or tapered object. If it was a tapered object, I'd maybe identify it, sketch it in a little bit of a different way, maybe choose a different angle, something of that sort. And again, reminding everybody this is a bird's eye view, a bird's eye 3-point perspective, while the blue one is a standard 2-point perspective. And that's sort of it for the color values, the color rendering. And I think I'm having a conversation with my students here a little bit about how to transition, or how much to transition a value across a plane. And this can be a little bit of a difficult subject to teach in a very specific or an exact way. I've seen it in many different books indicated, and so I'm sketching out here in pencil now, just a simple graphite pencil, similar cube. And talking about how, maybe some of that transitioning effect, maybe starting on that back corner, creating more contrast between your different planes. And one way to create that contrast is to vary or transition the value. So up here in the front, on the left, top left leading corner of the cube, kind of building up a bit of density. I've seen examples of this where it can be pushed a little bit too strong, I believe, or personally, for my aesthetic taste anyway. And it can create, if it's done too much, it can create the impression or the illusion of almost like a curved surface. And that can be very much in conflict with what the profile edges are telling the eye about that form or that object. So here we're seeing really sharp corners. So you don't want too much transition on that tonal value. Sometimes you're just looking for just enough to create a little kick and a little contrast to the eye. But if it gets too much, if it gets to be too contrasty, then it'll just look off. So I'm just having a conversation with my students and showing some variation of technique, letting my line work fade off a little bit. Here I'm just talking about the value of different types of crosshatch or different line. If you make your line slower, you'll leave behind more graphite or more line or more ink, depending if you're using an ink pen or a marker or a graphite pencil, you'll leave behind a little bit more line. Here I'm coming back and working across the plane and developing that plane a little bit. So I'm bouncing around a little bit in what I'm talking about and describing for my students, just to reinforce, again, plane logic, but also convergence and developing the contrast in your drawings. From here, a student has a lot of options and choices in terms of if you want to make sharp edges or if you want to use thicker profile lines, or if you want more of a realist aesthetic, then you can get rid of profile lines altogether and build your contrast through simple planar values and backgrounds and things of that sort. Here I'm sketching yet another cube, and this time with the Sharpie, again with the fine tip on the Sharpie. The initial baseline edges go down really light. If I'm reasonably close, then I feel good, and I come back and I start to commit to those edges a bit stronger. So this is perfectly acceptable as well as for a cube. Here I'm laying in my profile edge relative to the leading edges. And you can see now I've got 2 line weights. And we like to encourage everyone to always have at least 3 values. So I'm now coming in and putting a strong base on the cube with the thicker end of the Sharpie. And here I'm just identifying the 3 different types of edges. Object definition, which is the leading edges, the profile line, which is the thicker one, and then a baseline. Oftentimes you don't necessarily need that base if you've built up a strong shadow. So depending on the character and the direction of your drawing, there's a lot of different ways of executing a very sound and solid drawing or sketch that takes on and has the characteristics of the logic of perspective, that anchors it in the perspective system and will hold it together. And each one of those techniques will ultimately be fine as long as your fundamentals are together. Here I'm laying down my contrast. That's a single pass of, say, cross-hatching. Just talking about laying down very, very parallel lines. I'm coming perpendicular to that corner, to the leading corner across the face, and the opposite panel or the opposite plane on the right, laying down, again, very, very even crosshatch lines, very controlled, very slow and patient. Again, this is twice as fast as I sketch them. Over here on the side, I'm showing a little detail of, you could do cross-hatching that goes vertical and then horizontal and then diagonal at 45 degrees and then diagonal again at 45 degrees across from that. Or you can also just lay your pattern down with more density, closer together, maybe slower line work so that a little bit more ink sticks to the paper. And you'll get more contrast between that right plane and the left plane, and of course between the top plane as well. And of course in this cube, I have no value on that top plane. And I'm just discussing some of the shortcuts that you take as a designer as you develop a little bit more experience. That's it. Thanks.